Good morning and welcome again to Coffee with Mr. V. And today I'm just replying to a particular student's email which asked me to talk about living standards within the economics course. Living standards really comes up in theme 4, whether you're doing theme 4 in the A level or theme 4 for the IB. It's very much a core part of the development economics specification that we study. So I'm going to do that today, and in particular I'm going to focus on the relationship between economic growth and economic development. As I do this, probably realize that a lot of these things probably need some greater clarification. So this is probably going to end up being a series of videos based around kind of that early part of theme 4 and development economics. So here we go. You know how to, you know what to do this with yourselves. For Coffee with Mr. V, you need to go and grab yourself a cup of coffee. And then with me, we are going to do the synchronized sip. So go and put some coffee or your favorite liquid into a mug, a glass, or a cup, and then back with me. 3, 2, 1, here we go. I do love coffee. So, economic growth then. Let's just be clear on what we mean by economic growth. We mean GDP, gross domestic product, okay? Hopefully by now you'll have done the different methods of calculating GDP. So you should be happy that GDP is simply synonymous with the idea of AD. I mean, that is essentially the expenditure method of calculating GDP, all of the spending on domestic goods and services that goes on in an economy. Or another way to think about it, if you prefer to visualize it a different way, just call it national income. It's essentially adding up everybody's income in the economy for the production of goods and services that they make. So when we talk about economic growth, we're talking about real GDP increasing. We could be talking about simply that, the aggregate demand curve moving to the right, okay, and aggregate demand therefore going that way, and obviously national income increasing. However, you'll obviously know, because you'll have done these models quite a lot by now, that has a limit. Okay, that will only ever go as far as the PPF. So again, when we talk about economic growth, we're also quite often talking about that AS curve shifting to the right as well. Because, well, particularly if we're a classical economist, the only way that we can get long run economic growth is by shifting that PPF, shifting the AS curve to the right as well. So that's what we mean by economic growth. We basically mean, excuse me, we mean talking. We mean coming across to the right of the on the x-axis of the ADAS diagram. Now, does that automatically lead to economic development? Well, again, there's a lot of concepts in theme 4 that are what I would call contested concepts. That means that there isn't one singular definition that everybody agrees upon. So the whole idea of economic development is itself a contested concept. But I think the IB spec in particular is very good with this, and the A level is, doesn't disagree with anything the IB says here. In a sense, we managed to boil it down to 4 things. Yeah, we can measure economic development according to 4 things, and there are a range of factors here, and all of them are this idea that it's more multi-dimensional than just one factor. It's not just healthcare, it's not just education, and it's not just this thing called living standards, whatever living standards are. Okay, we need to measure it across a broad range of things. Now, it could certainly be more than 4, and by all means, you shouldn't see this as an exhaustive list. Those of you that do geography will have a number of different factors that you could measure alongside this as well. So access to clean water, percentage of the population that have access to the internet. Actually, for the A levels amongst you, we should probably also put national happiness in there as well, since that is a part of the theme 2 aspect of the A level course. All right. But these are the main measures that we should be happy with. And the big question is, does an increase in GDP growth necessarily lead to an increase in all these factors of economic development. Let's just very quickly go through them then. HDI, the Human Development Index, that's our measure for living standards in economics, okay? And it is it measures three things. It measures healthcare through life expectancy. It measures education through mean number of years in school, and it measures average income, which actually takes GNI per capita as its measure. There's equal weightings, and essentially what it says is if you're living for a long time, if you've got high life expectancy, if you go to school for a long time, and if you're rich, then you have high living standards. That's what HDI is essentially measuring. Poverty then, I suppose what we're talking about there is the percentage of the population in poverty. Poverty can be measured two ways. Poverty can be measured as relative poverty or absolute poverty. Absolute poverty is the one that probably most people have heard of straight off the bat. It depends on when you're watching this video, but I think for the moment it is the threshold for absolute poverty is $1.90 per day. So if somebody is earning underneath $1.90 per day, they are said to be in absolute poverty. Relative poverty, on the other hand, is normally taken as 60% of the median average income of a country. So it measures poverty within the country rather than absolutely in the world. And the idea of poverty, remember, is are your citizens struggling to meet their most basic wants and needs? Okay, so again, it's similar to living standards, but it's measuring something slightly different, which is this idea of struggling to meet basic wants and needs. Okay. Income equality, we've done lots on that in previous episodes as well. It's just the distribution of income within a particular country, and we use the Lorenz curve and the Gini coefficient to tell us about that. And then jobs, well, we use the unemployment rate really to measure jobs, but I think you should also in the back of your head be thinking about potential for job creation in the future, and also whether or not the labour force has the requisite skills for those jobs available too. So by all means use the unemployment rate, so use the claimant count, use the labour force survey if you're talking about the UK. Be aware that there might be other unemployment rate measures that other countries use, so you might come up against that in a case study and be prepared to use those as well. And lastly, national happiness. So particularly for the A-level amongst you, just be aware of things like national happiness, which take into account lots of different things depending on the happiness measure that's being used. So the wellness measure in the UK, which is the one I've introduced you to, takes into things like personal freedoms, family situation, and what was the other one? Families. Well, it does wealth. Or rather income, it does healthcare as well, and it also does education levels, and I think religious ability to practice your religious beliefs. Okay, so the big question is, does this lead to this? Because obviously if this did lead to this, then we've solved all the development issues in the world, because all we need to do is make people rich. Yeah, we increase GDP and we've increased all of those. And that's not a bad way of kind of introducing development economics. It's not, essentially we're testing that theory. If we increase GDP, do we increase all these things on the right? Look, it'll depend on the data that you find. But in class, I will show you lots of data that says, the richer countries tend to have higher HDI. It turns out that as countries get richer, their life expectancies increase, their child mortality decreases, and we get less people, particularly in absolute poverty. Okay, so there does seem to be a positive correlation there. GDP and income inequality, well, there is something called the Kuznets curve. In fact, Kuznets won the Nobel Prize based on his work here. And what he kind of argued was that as GDP increases within a country, you kind of get this effect going on. But actually, as we get richer, the income distribution within the economy will get worse, the Gini will go up. That's because, particularly if you're thinking about a free market economy, probably here you're coming from a very communist socialist economy, and then you're moving to capitalism and you're getting richer. Okay, that's fundamental reason why lots of countries shift over to capitalism. It's seen as the market system, which will give a lot of growth. But the consequence of that is that the capitalists, the owners of the factors of production, get very, very rich, whilst the workers not so much. So the gap of income gets wider. And then his big assertion was that once a country gets rich, can sort of turn their attention to fixing that inequality gap through redistribution of income policies. So we tax the high income earning households more, and we give more away in generous welfare state provisions, benefits on the other side, and you actually bring it down. Is the Kuznets curve right? Well, again, it's going to depend on the data that you use, but I would say whilst there is some evidence of this happening, particularly in North Europe, Scandinavian countries, there's a lot of examples of where this certainly hasn't happened. So, for example, America is the largest country in the world. The USA has a very poor Gini. It's higher than 0.4, which is normally the cutoff for saying a country is suffering from income inequality. And you can see it happening in quite a lot of Far East Asian countries as well, where actually as they're getting richer, the Gini is simply going up and up and up and up and up. Okay, so GDP does not necessarily lead to a decrease in income inequality, and since it doesn't lead to necessarily lead to an improvement in income inequality, then actually you still get quite high levels of relative poverty even in very rich countries. So empirically, that doesn't necessarily come out as well. And then GDP and jobs. Well, it would certainly seem right to say that as GDP increases, then you would expect the unemployment rate to decrease, particularly cyclical unemployment, because whenever there's an increase in aggregate demand, you would expect cyclical unemployment to fall. However, you know from doing lots of stuff on unemployment that you can't necessarily assume that the unemployment rate will fall because it depends on the type of unemployment. Clearly, if GDP does increase, then there's greater potential for that money to be spent on things like education and training programs, which might fix structural unemployment. It might also fix geographic unemployment because you might be building infrastructure. Or if it's seasonal unemployment, then you might use that money to kind of reinvest into industries that are non-seasonal. So taking your economy away from, say, an agricultural base and putting yourself into a less seasonal industry. So I would say at its heart, we would expect as GDP goes up that economic development should happen, but it doesn't always. Okay, and why not? Okay, so what are the big limitations to this? Well, just on a kind of measure basis, you can't say that just because GDP increases that this will necessarily increase. Okay, so why not? Well, for one, you need to look at the distribution of income. So GDP itself doesn't tell you anything about how that income is being redistributed. I mean, we talked about the national income increasing, but that's the total national income. There's nothing to say that everybody is getting richer. It might just be one person. It might just be the top 10% of income earners in the country that are getting richer. So just because GDP is increasing, don't assume that everybody is getting richer. It might just be restricted to that top end, and therefore you might get income inequality, as we've talked about. Okay, another thing, government may not redistribute it equally or equitably. We've assumed here that our government will take the increase in the tax revenue that it might see and use it to close the income inequality gap, or take people out of poverty, or spend it on healthcare, public and merit goods, which would increase life expectancy and increase the mean number of years in school. But that's an assumption, and there's nothing to say that would necessarily happen, particularly if you had a very corrupt government, a government that, the dictator of that particular government took a lot of that money for his own personal fortune. It doesn't have to be corruption, though. It might just simply be malinvestment, so incompetence. We're investing in projects that simply we don't see the reward from. So that might be, I don't know, think about building a nuclear power plant on a tectonic fault line. Okay, I've got a really good example of that from the Philippines. Yeah, lots of money went into developing a nuclear power station, which was meant to give lots of electricity to the population, and that would solve a lot of these HDI poverty issues. If you were giving electricity to a population that previously didn't have electricity, but they built it on a tectonic fault line, so it was always a danger that it might, there might be an earthquake, that it might explode, you might have a nuclear fallout. So despite spending all of this money, they never opened it. Another example of malinvestment might be building a motorway system, which, I don't know, you use the wrong tarmac or something like that and simply melts in the summer or something like that. So it's not always corruption, but it might also be malinvestment. Another thing is that we are not taking into account, I mean, it's not taking into account a lot of things. It's not taking into account PPP, purchasing power parity. So actually this increase in GDP might not necessarily increase HDI or poverty if our living standards, if our cost of living in the country is very high compared to other countries. PPP, remember, adjusts your GDP figure for costs of living. So if your costs of living, as I say, are very high, or if they increase alongside GDP, then actually your real income isn't changing. Yeah, you can simply buy the same things that you were able to buy before. What else is it not taking into account? It is, at the moment, as GDP, it's not taking account the average income figure, because we haven't divided it by the population. So it's not a mean figure, and it's not a median figure either. So that kind of plays into the idea of distribution of income and income inequality, that we don't know whether lots of people are getting rich or just a few people getting rich. Okay, what else? I mean, that's a what have I listed here? Percentage change in GDP, we could also hang by. Has it increased by 10%, or has it increased by 0.1%? Because again, obviously that would have a huge difference over here. It's also a GDP figure, sorry, and not a GNI figure. So how much of this money is actually being earned by foreign nationals in a particular country, rather than the nationals of that country, and that matters because it matters in terms of where that money is therefore then likely to be spent. So if it's being earned by people who live in the country and stay in the country, then fine, you would expect a lot of it to then be injected into the circular flow of income. On the other hand, if your income is being made, if a lot of your income is being made by foreign nationals, then actually a lot of it then be transferred out of the country. Repatriation of profits, repatriation of wages, okay, and therefore you wouldn't see the increases in economic development that you would expect to see. So there's a starter for 10 to get you thinking about why an increase in economic GDP and an increase in economic growth, as illustrated by an increase in GDP, might not necessarily lead to an increase in economic development. And the key here with economic development essays is to make sure you're talking about these things on my right and not this thing on the left. Okay, examiners are very keen to make sure that when they ask you questions about economic development, that you are talking about economic development, that you're talking about development issues, and you're not just talking about GDP. Yes, you would expect there to be a relationship. That's the whole foundation of economic development as a topic. Yeah, we're expecting these things to increase. We would expect to see a correlation for the reasons that I gave you at the outset, but there are a lot of reasons why it might not happen. And indeed, those are the things that we want to get into as economists. Why is this not happening, so that we can then go and fix it, so that we can provide development solutions. And that's where we're going with the topic of development. So thank you for coming along. Hopefully that made a little bit of sense, and I will carry on with this because it's an important part of the spec for you to get right, and it's also somewhere that you might be able to gain some sort of competitive advantage on other students who are learning this thing, because a lot of the time it's not done particularly well. So if you manage to do it well, good for you. All right, thanks for coming along, and I will see you next time.